Welcome back, scholars, to another day of history with Mr. Amador. All right, so we have been learning about the reform movements in the 1800s. We've been learning about slavery, and we've been learning about the differences between the North and South. So for this unit, we're going to be diving deeper into what tears the North and South apart and what is going to lead to them to go to war against each other, which is going to be known as the American Civil War, where Americans are at war with Americans, the North versus the South. So we're going to see what happens in the 1800s that is going to lead to this war happening in 1860 between the United States and the United States, the North versus the South. All right, here we go. In 1860, after one of the strangest elections in the nation's history, an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln was elected president. On learning of his victory, Lincoln said to the reporters covering the campaign, "Well, boys, your troubles are over, and mine have just begun." Within a few weeks, it became clear just how heavy those troubles would be. By the time Lincoln took office, the nation had split apart over the issue of states' rights regarding slavery and was preparing for civil war. The survival of the United States of America and the fate of millions I believe it's 6 million, if I'm, sorry, my thing's in the way. I believe it's 6 million. And the fate of 6 million slaves rested in Lincoln's hands. So Lincoln had the hardest job any president had at that point. When he became president, the country was literally falling apart and about to go to war. So Lincoln had to keep the United States of America together, keep the Union meaning the United States. So when you see that word Union, it means the United States. All right, let's keep going. The issues Lincoln faced could be traced back to 1619, when the first slave ship arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Since that time, slavery had ended in half of the United States, and the question remained whether the nation could continue being half slave and half free. For decades, Americans tried to avoid this question, and many hoped that slavery would simply die out on its own. Instead, slavery began to expand into new territories, think of Manifest Destiny, and the question could no longer be ignored. Between 1820 and 1860, Americans tried to fashion several compromises on the issues of slavery, but these compromises created new problems and new divisions. Slavery was not simply a political issue to be worked out through compromises. Compromise is like an agreement. Rather, it was a deeply moral issue, which is something Lincoln understood. As he wrote in a letter to a friend, "If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong." In this lesson, you will learn how Americans tried to keep the United States united despite the deep divisions over slavery. And some events during this period kept the nation together, as we'll learn about some of these compromises, whereas others pulled it apart. You will also find out how Americans finally answered the question of whether a nation founded on the idea of freedom could exist half slave, half free. All right, let's continue on. All right, confronting the issue of slavery. A traveler heading west across the Appalachians after the War of 1812 wrote, "Old America seems to be breaking up and moving westward." It was true. By 1819, settlers had formed 7 new states west of the Appalachian Mountains. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, Congress had established a process for forming new states. In addition to outlining the steps needed for statehood, this law also banned slavery north of the Ohio River. As a result, the 3 western states that formed north of the Ohio River, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, became free states. And then the 4 states that formed south of the Ohio River, which is Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi, permitted slavery. So they allowed slavery in those states. In 1819, Alabama and Missouri applied to Congress for statehood as slave states. No one in Congress questioned admitting Alabama as a slave state, as it was located far south of the Ohio River and was surrounded by other slave states. But Congress had another reason for admitting Alabama with no debate. For years, there had been an unspoken agreement in Congress to keep the number of slave states and free states equal, a balance that had been upset by the admission of Illinois as a free state in 1818. So, by accepting Alabama with slavery, Congress was able to restore the balance with half states being slave and half the states being free. But now that Missouri wants to be a slave state, that was another matter. So questions about Missouri. Some Northerners in Congress questioned whether Missouri should be admitted as a slave state because most of Missouri laid north of the point where the Ohio River flows into the Mississippi. So based on the Northwest Ordinance, there cannot be slavery above the Ohio River, which Missouri, most of it is. Not all of it, but most of it. On the eastern side of Mississippi, slavery was banned north of that point. Should this ban not also be applied to west of the Mississippi River? The question led to another one. If Missouri were allowed to enter the Union, that means the United States, as a slave state, some ask, what would keep slavery from spreading across all of the Louisiana Territory? The vision of a block of new slave states stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains was enough to give some Northerners nightmares. So the North did not want Missouri to become a slave state because it was scared that other northern states in the Louisiana Territory would become slave as well. Northerners did not want slavery to move west. They did not want slavery to move west. Let's keep moving. The Tallmadge Amendment. When the bill to make Missouri a state came before Congress, Representative James Tallmadge of New York proposed an amendment to the bill. The amendment said that Missouri could join the Union, but only as a free state, so saying that Missouri cannot be a slave state. And Southerners in Congress protested Tallmadge Amendment. What right, they asked, did Congress have to decide whether a new state should be slave or free? According to the theory of states' rights favored by many Southerners, Congress had no power to impose its will on any state, old or new. Instead, Southerners argued that the people of each state should decide whether to permit slavery. The fight over slavery thus involved a basic question about the powers of the federal and the state governments under the Constitution. So one of his big things that are besides slavery is going to be this whole issue between federal and state government. The South preaching more that states should have more rights and have more power, while the North is going to be more about the federal government having more power under the Constitution. But the big issue here is always going to be slavery. The North doesn't like it. The South thrives on it. All right, let's go ahead and look real quick at the number of free states and slave states in the United States in 1819. So before Missouri comes in, Missouri's going to come in 1820. So before that, we can see we're dead even. Out of the original 13 states, you can see that 7 of them are free, while 6 of them are still slave. And then we can see Vermont, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois all joined as free states. And then Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama are all going to be slave states. So they're balanced. They're balanced right now. 11 states each. All right. A deadlocked Congress. Southerners' protests were based on their view that if Congress were allowed to end slavery in Missouri, that it might try to end slavery elsewhere, like Virginia or Georgia. The North already had more votes in the House of Representatives than the South, but in the Senate, the two sections had equal voting power. This is very important. As long as the number of free states and slave states remained equal, Southern senators could defeat any attempt to interfere with slavery. However, if Missouri entered the Union as a free state, then the South would lose its power to block anti-slavery bills in the Senate, which would mean disaster for the South. Meaning that if they have one extra free state, that no slave laws will be able to be passed because they will never have the majority. It would always be those who come from free states. In the North, the Talmadge Amendment awakened strong feelings against slavery. Many people sent petitions to the Congress condemning slavery as immoral and unconstitutional. Arguing in favor of the amendment, New Hampshire Representative Arthur Livermore spoke for many Northerners when he said, "An opportunity is now presented to prevent the growth of a sin which sits heavy on the souls of every one of us. By embracing this opportunity, we may retrieve the national character and, in some degree, our own." Great quote there, saying like, hey, if we can try to end the slavery now, we might be able to save American history from disgrace, right? Our character, and hopefully gain some of our own. All right, the House voted to approve the Talmadge Amendment, which doesn't surprise anyone because there's more Northerners in the House of Representatives than there are Southerners. But the Senate, Southerners were able to defeat it because they had equal number. So the two houses were now deadlocked over the issue of slavery in Missouri, and they would remain so as the 1819 session of Congress drew to a close. So it looks like they don't know what's going to happen with Missouri because it's a tie. And they don't know what's going to happen, but y'all are going to find out what's going to happen next. All right, so before y'all find out what happens, you guys are going to have to answer some questions. So on the next slide, you'll have about 5 minutes to answer some of the questions about stuff that we've read about. And then y'all are going to be reading about the Missouri Compromise, what the Missouri Compromise was about, its causes, and its effects. All right, I will see y'all back here. When will I see y'all? See y'all Wednesday. Have a great day, y'all.